A couple of days ago on Saturday, I, along with many other Australians, reflected on our history, a very specific part of our history, and one that we are not proud of, nor should we be. 2 days ago was National Sorry Day, a day designed to prompt us to remember and commemorate the mistreatment of the country's Aboriginal people, in particular, the stolen generations. It's now been more than a decade since Kevin Rudd, the then Prime Minister of Australia, apologised to this country's Aboriginal and Islander people for a history of unequal laws and policies. Our next speaker has witnessed this inequality throughout his life. Stan Grant is the Indigenous Affairs Editor for the ABC and Special Advisor to the Prime Minister on Indigenous constitutional recognition. His constant pursuit of equality and justice has moved many, and his political speeches and commentary on issues of inequality, both involving Indigenous Australians and otherwise, continue to inspire many. I know they inspire me. His book, Talking to My Country, is a must-read for every Australian. Please make him welcome.
Thank you very much for that, and thank you for clearing all of our heads as well before I get down to what I want to talk about over the next hour. I want to pay respect to the Wurundjeri people on whose land we meet today, and from my people, the Wiradjuri and the Gamalroy, bring respect and greetings as well. I was just really interested in what Paul was having to say a minute ago about the strategic landscape, and I suppose that's what I really want to talk to you about today. And my own reflections on how we lift the questions of Indigenous issues in Australia out of a parochial context and look at them more as part of the global questions that we're grappling with at the moment around issues of justice and democracy and what it is to live in a global order that's very much under strain. We're here to talk about reconciliation and mark yet another sorry day to reflect on where we are as a nation. But I want to take you back to before Kevin Rudd's apology to the stolen generations a decade ago in 2008. And I want to take you back to September 11, 2001. And that, of course, is a date that we know changed our world and profoundly altered the course of my own life. I remember it clearly. I was about to go to bed, and as I do, switched on the television news to take one last look at the world. There was the sight of a burning tower in New York City. The first plane had struck the World Trade Center. News reporters at the time were talking then about an accident, perhaps even speculation it may have just been a light aircraft. But as I watched, and I'm sure many of you on here today saw as well, another plane slammed into the second tower. And like most of you, I've never forgotten that image of the huge passenger jet hurtling at full speed low over the New York skyline and that roaring noise and the moment of impact. I remember I reached for my phone, it was late at night, and I called an American friend and said to her, "You must turn on the television." Our world in that moment had changed. Within hours, the world knew of Al-Qaeda and the war on terror began, and it hasn't ended. For me, within a matter of weeks, I was working for the American network CNN. It began a decade-long odyssey that took me to Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Syria, Jordan, Egypt. I saw bombings, far too many dead bodies. I spoke to those who had survived and to terrorists who'd carried out these attacks. Then in May 2010, I stood outside Osama bin Laden's house in Abbottabad in Pakistan after American troops had stormed in the middle of the night, killing the Al-Qaeda leader and bookending a remarkable decade. So why does this matter? And how does this fit into our discussion here today? Because it marks a fundamental turning point in our world, and it poses questions that impact profoundly on the future of our democracies and ultimately questions of Indigenous rights here in Australia. I've seen our world turn. It's been a front row seat at history. It's led me to ask harder and more complex questions about who we are, the role of race and identity, and the future of our world order. I want to take you back even further now to the summer of 1989, when a then little-known analyst at the US State Department, Francis Fukuyama, penned an essay for the magazine National Interest. He called it "The End of History?" ? And that question mark is important, as you'll come to see. Now, this was after the fall of the Berlin War and the end, or the Berlin Wall, and the end of the great Cold War standoff between East and West, communism versus capitalism. It had stretched for nearly half a century. It had fueled war in Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan, amongst others, and it had at times threatened to tip our world into outright nuclear war. We came so perilously close. But here was the triumph of the West. Fukuyama argued that liberal democracy may constitute, in his words, the end point of mankind's ideological evolution, the final form of human government, indeed, the end of history. It may sound strange to say the end of history because, of course, history does not end as such. There are always events and the lives of all of us continue, but Fukuyama was talking about history in a different and altogether more profound sense. He was talking about history as the struggle for justice, for freedom, and for recognition. He was talking about an arc of progress that he believed had now delivered humanity to its summit. It wasn't an original idea. It was rooted in the work of the monumental German philosopher G.W.F. Hegel. It was Hegel who first believed he had seen the end of history when he glimpsed the triumphant Napoleon after the Battle of Jena in 1806. As Hegel said, "I saw the emperor, this world spirit, go out from the city to survey his realm, stretching over the world and dominating it." Hegel, and thus Fukuyama, believed in history as progress, that we move through different epochs to an absolute spirit. For Hegel, this was Napoleon. For Fukuyama, this was the idea of liberal democracy. And central to this idea of freedom and recognition, yes, the campaign for recognition here in Australia, Indigenous recognition in the Constitution or in treaties, is rooted in philosophy. The Greeks called it themos, a part of the soul from which rises the desire for self-esteem. Hegel said this separated humans from animals. We desire to be recognised by other humans. Hegel said it was the very engine of history itself. People would stake their lives in combat to achieve it. As Fukuyama wrote, these parts of the human personality are critical to political life. To Hegel, an individual only achieves self-consciousness by being recognised by other human beings. We wish to be recognised by humans and recognised as human. Someone subjugated by politics, history, hierarchy cannot be free. To Hegel, both the master and the slave were locked in a struggle to be free. Hegel saw this as saw it in the great revolutions of France and America that gave rise to new forms of political representation that threw off old hierarchies. To Hegel, history came to an end because the struggle for recognition had been met in societies categorised by universal and reciprocal recognition. Surveying the world in 1989, Francis Fukuyama certainly believed the world had reached its endpoint. As he wrote back then, as mankind approaches the end of the millennium, the twin crises of authoritarianism and socialist central planning have left only one competitor standing in the ring as an ideology of potential universal validity. Liberal democracy, he wrote, the doctrine of individual freedom and popular sovereignty. In many ways, that argument is borne out. According to Freedom House, which measures the spread and health of democracy, in 1970 there were fewer than 30 countries that counted themselves as democracies. By 2014, there were more than 140, about 70% of the world. And who's sitting here today, for all the troubles that we have in our own country, would opt to live in Syria or Iran or Russia or China than to live with the freedoms that we enjoy in liberal democracies? As Winston Churchill famously said, democracy is the worst form of government except for all the others. The end of history indeed. But remember how I mentioned that question mark at the end of the title of Fukuyama's essay? The end of history, question mark. In later writings, including a book on the subject, Fukuyama dispensed with the question. The end of history became a statement of fact. He would wish that he hadn't. What we have seen in the 3 decades since the end of the Cold War, far from the end of history, is in fact the return of history. New ideological battles have emerged, new battles from old wars. The world today is awash with conflict. We've seen a resurgence of sectarianism, authoritarianism, and political tribalism. The very idea of liberalism that undergirds democracy is under attack. The political scientist David Runciman has written that this is the crisis facing Western democracies. We don't know what failure looks like anymore, and we have no idea how much danger we are in. The political scientist Peter Mayer opened his 2013 book, Ruling the Void, the Hollowing Out of Western Democracy, with this sentence: "The age of democracy is dead." Political parties, he argued, have become disconnected from wider society. There is a fractured political landscape, crises of legitimacy and effectiveness. 3 significant events stand out. One is the rise of Islamist terrorism, as I talked about with Al-Qaeda, the global financial crisis, and the increasing power of China. When I saw those twin towers collapsing, I was watching the return of history. This was a rejection of the very values that Fukuyama's liberal democracies were said to represent by a small, but what's proved to be enormously influential, radicalised group of Islamists. Bin Laden's Al-Qaeda have weaponised religion, not for the first time in history, and violently rejected the ideals of universalism and individualism. In 2008, the collapse of the big banks, which sparked what has become known as the global financial crisis, rocked the foundations of the liberal democratic order. On a personal level, economic collapse has cost jobs and homes, and more broadly, as The Economist magazine has pointed out, the damage the crisis did was psychological as well as financial. It revealed fundamental weaknesses in the West's political systems, undermining the self-confidence that had been one of their greatest assets. People who lost their homes and livelihoods looked on as the newly elected US President Barack Obama, a man whose own elevation to the White House was meant to presage a new dawn for his country, let the bankers off scot-free. They were deemed too big to fail. Those who profited from a corrupt, exploitative system, who rigged the game in their favour, signing up gullible, vulnerable people to a complex what amounted really to a financial shell game, paid no price. The government propped them up as people went to the wall. The global financial crisis has shone a spotlight on the growing inequality, issues that I know you've been discussing here today, that is eroding the democratic order. If democracies cannot deliver on the promise of a better future, then the future of democracy itself is at risk. While the liberal democratic West has struggled, China has continued to grow. It was able to withstand the global financial crisis and suddenly present an alternative. The Chinese Communist Party could claim that it had a better model. I spent a decade reporting from China for CNN, witnessing the economic miracle that lifted 500 million people out of poverty and took a country that was once known as the sick man of Asia to the point where it is, by some measurements, the biggest economy in the world. And China has done so while rejecting the universal ideas of human rights or democracy. As it gets richer and more powerful, it is not embracing liberalism but doubling down on authoritarianism. As someone who reported there, who was locked up on several occasions, harassed, surveilled, had their family continuously followed, I can tell you it is much easier to report in a country like Australia than to report in China. But others have been looking on. Countries have taken an autocratic turn, weakening their own democracies. Turkey, under Recep Tayyip Erdogan, is cracking down on opponents and locking up journalists. Vladimir Putin jails his rivals, and Hungary's Viktor Orban has transformed from a one-time student democracy campaigner to a political demagogue. Indeed, he has introduced a new phrase to politics, illiberal democracy. Democracy stripped of all of those liberal values that we actually continue to try to hold on to. Freedom House, which once counted the spread of democracy, released a report, Freedom in the World 2015, discarding democracy and the return of the iron fist. It's found an erosion in civil liberties and rule of law, claiming that democracy, remember that was at a high point in the early 2000s, was now under greater threat than at any point in the last 25 years. Since then, two more events have shaken the global politics: Brexit and the Trump presidency. In the words of the political writer David Goodhart, the two events marked not so much the arrival of the new populist era, but its coming of age. Goodhart says they were about a core values divide. People who felt that their country and their political leadership no longer spoke to them, that they were looking for alternatives, even if that alternative meant leaving the European Union or electing Donald Trump. Britain's vote to leave the EU highlighted a flaw in the European project and globalisation more broadly, that it weakens ideas of national sovereignty. You'll often hear people say that they've lost their country, that the open borders, open trade, the free movement of people has eroded the sense of what it is to belong. David Goodhart has written that the desire to transcend nation, to put nation in the past, was at the heart of the European project. But as Ivan Krastev, another political writer, has said in his book After Europe, the EU has always been an idea in search of a reality. Countries lose control of their borders and their economies, and blowback is inevitable. Donald Trump identified those same anti-globalisation, anti-deindustrialisation tensions to win the White House, campaigning on secure borders and tougher trade, America first, anti-immigration and America first. He has ridden this wave of populism that has seen disruptors win office or strengthen their foothold in elections around the world. There is a paradox where democracy is being eroded by those who are using democracy itself to entrench their power. The Harvard University professors Stephen Levitsky and Daniel Ziblatt have written a book called How Democracies Die. Democracies die, they say, in war. They also die at the hands of elected leaders, presidents or prime ministers who subvert the very process that brought them to power. They worry about Donald Trump's attack on some of the institutions of democracy, judges and the media, and fear that the United States will abandon its role as a democracy promoter. But, they write, this democratic drift precedes Trump. The soft guardrails of American democracy, they say, have been weakening for decades. Trump is a litmus test of our political age, a celebrity non-politician whose pledge to drain the swamp resonated with an angry, ignored electorate. Levitsky and Ziblatt now worry about a post-Trump future marked by polarisation, more departures from unwritten political conventions, and increasing institutional warfare. In other words, democracy without solid guardrails. So what about Australia? We were cushioned against the worst of the global financial crisis in no small part because of China and its thirst for our national resources. But here too, democracy as we know it is under stress. Here too, there is a loss of faith and trust in institutions. We've had royal commissions into our justice system, our churches, and currently our banks. Public disaffection is growing, especially with the major parties. At the 2016 federal election, up to a third of voters rejected the ALP or the Liberal National Coalition. Opinion polls indicate nothing has changed. At state and federal levels, there is increased volatility rewarding more minor parties and independents. Voters have shown themselves especially keen on shaking up the makeup of the Senate. People are fleeing to the fringes, to the margins where elections are increasingly fought and won. Parties like Pauline Hanson's One Nation wield an outsized influence. So all of this brings us to the question of Indigenous rights. The survey of the globe post-Cold War is crucial. This goes to Paul's idea about the strategic landscape. Indigenous issues go to the very heart of the liberal democratic experiment. Indigenous rights pose critical questions for liberalism, questions we're still struggling to answer. The liberal project, emerging out of the 17th century age of enlightenment, encompassed also the age of discovery, dispossession and subjugation of Indigenous peoples. As the political philosopher Duncan Iveson has pointed out, Indigenous peoples were excluded from participating equally in the establishment of the international state system. Some Indigenous people reject liberalism as an ideology fundamentally incompatible with their claims for justice. It is, in my view, a self-defeating view that ignores potentially liberating ideas contained in liberalism itself. As Iveson has pointed out, it's not a matter of simply discarding European thought, but seeing how it can be taken hold of, translated, renewed from and for those people on the margins. Iveson has said, can liberal democracy become genuinely intercultural? He points out the claims of Indigenous people can question the source and the legitimacy of state authority. He asks, how can a nation become morally rehabilitated? How might the narratives of the nation be retold? The narrative of the nation. Think about that phrase because it asks us, who are we? It raises critical questions of history and identity. The French historian Ernest Renan was grappling with these themes more than a century ago. Renan wrote that nations seek a collective identity. A nation, he wrote, is a soul, a spiritual principle. But how to form a nation out of the conflicting stories of our past? This past year, we have seen Indigenous people present the nation with a unique opportunity. The Uluru Statement emerged from a nationwide deliberative process of discussion and negotiation with Indigenous communities, peak bodies and individual leaders, conducted by the Federal Parliament-appointed Referendum Council. The negotiations culminated in a meeting at Uluru, drawing together representatives from across the country, and the statement calling for, amongst other things, a truth and justice process, a move to drafting a makarata. Makarata is a Yolngu word from Arnhem Land that speaks of acknowledging peace after a struggle. The Uluru Statement sought to blend the fundamental spiritual sovereignty of Indigenous people with the political sovereignty of the Commonwealth. Its key recommendation was an Indigenous body, a voice, enshrined in the Constitution to ensure that Indigenous people have some input into policy making directed toward them. The Uluru Statement is a remarkable document. It is a profound statement and commitment to the principles of democracy. That it comes from those who have carried the greatest burden and felt the most estranged from this nation's democratic process makes it all the more remarkable. The Prime Minister as we know, has rejected that key recommendation of a constitutional voice. But the fight goes on. Remember Hegel and what he said about the fight for recognition and how it drives history. Indeed, to borrow from Frank Fukuyama, the Uluru Statement may represent our end of history moment, when we complete our liberal democracy. This is a critical issue for us as a nation, and it happens at a time when liberal democratic traditions are under siege, when some are talking about the end of liberalism and the death of democracy. This is the defining issue of our times. There is no more important issue right now than whether the foundations of a global order that has been maintained post-World War II, a global order that has led to us living longer, that has led to the longest sustained period of global peace the world has ever known, that has made us richer and healthier, that has led to innovations that, as we heard previously, allow us now to imagine a whole new future. All of that, potentially, could be at risk by the struggle of our age. Do those fundamental principles of democracy and freedom persist, or do we lurch into a new era of authoritarianism and illiberalism? And that is the choice that many people are making right now. The question of Indigenous rights fits into a global struggle for justice, recognition, and liberalism. If those people who have carried the heaviest weight and borne the greatest burden can present what Galarrwuy Yunupingu called a gift to the nation, the Uluru Statement, allowing a way into this democracy for those people who've been locked out. If Indigenous people can present that to Australia at this time, it's an extraordinary gift and one that we should not overlook. I'm heartened by the words of the French political writer and diplomat Alexis de Tocqueville, who in the 19th century famously travelled to America to encounter the nation's experiment in democracy. He saw the best and the worst. But as he wrote, democracies always look weaker than they really are. They are all confusion on the surface, but have lots of hidden strengths. The challenge for us in Australia is whether among those hidden strengths is a capacity to complete the work of this country and to bring those people locked out of the idea of democracy into what it means to be Australian in the 21st century. Thank you so much. I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Dan. That was is this on? That was an inspiring speech. Could we have questions, please? Hands up really high, because it's really hard for us to see you because there's lots of
one really
lights.
quickly up down here and very high. I can see in the middle.
Yep, Georgia.
Name's Anala. I'm a Yari woman. I bring warm greetings from my family and ancestors to you and yours. Thank you for speaking to my country. It resonated so deeply.
Thank you.
Thank you. My question is about decolonisation. Do you, as Indigenous people and communities, what do you think about us channeling our energies into decolonising and deconstructing the systems that we are in and that we come into contact with, or reconstructing and reconstituting our own systems?
That's a really good question.
Or both.
It's a really good question, and it's a fundamental question that goes to exactly the type of strains that I was talking about. The challenge for liberalism has always been, how does it encompass the rights of people who are outside of a liberal Western tradition? As I pointed out, for many people, Indigenous people, it is a struggle to get past the foundations of liberalism which walked hand in hand with colonialism and imperialism. that almost demands that people give up their own cultural traditions to become part of a more liberal tradition. That, I've really struggled and wrestled with that because having been a reporter in the world, having seen the worst of the world, if there is one thing I know, I would rather be an Aboriginal person living in Australia in this time than anyone else living anywhere else at any other time. For all of our faults, I would sooner be here now. I would sooner be an Aboriginal person living here now than in my grandfather's time or my father's time. We have more Aboriginal university graduates today than we have ever had in our history. We often talk, for instance, about the imprisonment statistics, and we should, because Indigenous people are far overrepresented in prison proportionally. But in Australia, there are around about 40,000 people in prison. Of those, about 25% are Indigenous, so there are around about 10,000 Indigenous people locked up. As I say, far too many proportionally. But there are almost 40,000 Aboriginal people with a university degree. 40,000. 4 times the number of people locked up today. I would sooner focus on these things. We can carry 2 thoughts. We can carry the thought of our success and our achievement and our resilience. At the same time, we can continue to point out just how far we still have to travel. So this fundamental question, do we reconstitute our forms or do we deconstruct the system to find a better fit for ourselves? It's a question that I grapple with constantly. And I've arrived at this point. I am a cosmopolitan person. I am not just Indigenous. I carry the blood of an Irish convict in my family ancestry. My mother's mother was white. I am coloniser and colonised. These are the contradictions of my own life and my own family's background, as they are the contradictions of us as a nation. We are a family who share much more in common, and yet we still have to grapple with those things and the historical legacy that continues to divide us. We live with these contradictions. I'm a person who has enjoyed a career that I could never have imagined having when I was growing up as a boy. We were poor, marginalised, black family. We moved from town to town. I didn't go to school properly until I was 14 years old. I changed school more than 14 or 15 times before I was even into high school. It was we were constantly moving, looking for work. I've grown up to have a life where I've travelled the world. I've lived in 5 different countries. I've reported from more than 80. I am, by any measure, a privileged person in Australia, by any measurement. So how do I marry those things, those contradictions? I'm a member of the most disadvantaged group in Australia, but I am an extraordinarily privileged Australian at the same time. We need to grapple with these contradictions, and we need to have a bigger view of the issues that affect us. Cosmopolitanism says that you are a person in the world. You are a global citizen. But I'm also rooted in a sense of place and a sense of identity. So philosophers have talked about this idea of rooted cosmopolitanism, that we hold to our traditions. Those things are the things that ground us. But at the same time, we are free to explore all the things that we want to be. More Indigenous people today, the overwhelming number, live in our cities and towns. The overwhelming number are mixed heritage, just like me. The majority have partners who are non-Indigenous. These are complicating issues to the very narrow ideas of identity. These are complex things. So when we talk about do we decolonise or do we reconstitute those old traditions, I don't see it as being that sort of a binary. I don't see it as that sort of question. I think it is the world that we are living in now. We need to open up more space within the idea of liberal democracy to incorporate the full range of who we are, to be able to bring different traditions to bear. Otherwise, the liberal democratic tradition itself and that foundation will fracture. And I think that's what lies at the heart of things like the Uluru Statement. I think that's what lies at the heart of what Indigenous campaigners for Indigenous rights have been pushing for decades. This idea that we can bring who we are to this country and find a place in this country and broaden and widen the idea of what it is to belong. I think that's the journey that we're on. And we're nowhere near getting to the final point of that. But it's a complex, complicated, confusing issue and journey. But these are the issues that face us in the world.
Next question, over there. Karen.
Stan, thanks for your presentation and also for your response to this question that we've just had. With the Uluru Statement being rejected out of hand by Turnbull, how shattering was that response to you and other people involved in the whole process? And where do you go from here with that statement?
Yeah. For those who didn't hear, the Prime Minister's rejection of the Uluru Statement, particularly I think the voice in the Constitution, is that shattering, and where do you go to from here? I think, for those people who are directly involved in it, they've continued that struggle, and there's an ongoing political process. The Prime Minister may have said that he disagrees or rejects elements of it, but there's now a parliamentary committee, and they're looking at different ways of being able to incorporate some of the aspirations and ambitions contained in that Uluru Statement. So that political process continues. But I don't think you can ever just draw a line in the sand and say, that's it. We give up, or, it's no longer worth the fight. This is an evolutionary process. When the Constitution was written, Indigenous people were not counted as members of the Commonwealth. It didn't deter people from beginning a process of activism that led to the 1967 referendum. The 1967 referendum was not an end in itself either. And that gave rise to a new generation of protest, the 1972 Tent Embassy and the push for land rights. The push for land rights led to people like Eddie Mabo, who had lost at every single turn through the Queensland courts, finally going all the way to the Supreme Court to have acknowledged what we always knew, that terra nullius, empty land, the extinguishment of Aboriginal rights to land, was a fiction, and that the recognition of those rights could be incorporated within our system of justice, within Australia's system of justice, and could be legislated within our political system. So I don't think it's an option to just say we give up, that we take this rejection as a permanent no. This is the to and fro of a political process. This is why democracies need constant vigilance. This is what it is to be in a democracy. It is to participate. It's to push against those boundaries. It's to challenge. There'll be an election. People will be able to vote precisely on these types of issues. If these things matter to you, make it part of your vote. This is what people will choose to do. But also, I think it's also important to point out that within what we see as the Indigenous community, there are many communities. And there is not just a homogeneity when it comes to Aboriginal communities either. That different people have different views and different communities seek different things and different outcomes. So, that's what it is to live in a democracy, to push against that, to have your voice heard, to be able to use those freedoms to challenge the system, to look for new innovations. For people like Duncan Iverson, who have said, can you make a process that traditionally worked against Indigenous people incorporate the aspirations for Indigenous people? That's really the business that we're in, I think.
Joost.
Thank you, Stan. I started this conversation with you once at a book launch in Melbourne, but you've said something now that's rattled me. I've done a lot of work with Uncle Boydie, grandson of William Cooper, who's tried to get the agenda picked up on all the activism that when he walked with his grandfather to things like the original day of mourning in 38 at Australian Hall, which Australian politicians say, why you're talking about changing the date is a recent thing. It's clearly not recent. But your answer to the last question, which was where half of my question was going, was about we shouldn't give up on the politicians and we can vote, and what the political aspirants can do about the challenges of the 1 year ago today when the statement from the heart was rejected. But the politicians and others that I've talked to and others that I know have talked to about why they did that have said, in a very nice pat answer, the community doesn't care. The community
the Australian community.
The Australian community doesn't care. And those that want the change will just want it, whether it's treaty, whether it's constitutional recognition or anything else, so that they can say, we've ticked the box, we've shut those Aboriginal people up with these demands, now shut up and move on with something else. So that and that's the only reason many of them have said to people that I know who've been working with Uncle Boydie and others, maybe something will get through. But I want to pick up, and I'd love your response.
Yeah.
And we're a community in control.
Yeah.
What about the comment that the politicians are arguing that the community, the broader Australian community, doesn't really care? Shouldn't the conversation maybe, and perhaps you can offer us some strategies, not just be with the political enterprise, but with the groundswell, the grassroots?
No, I totally what you mean. Well, look at the Uluru process, for instance. That was a community-driven process. People went around to different communities, different people represented their communities at the Uluru Summit. This was a deliberative, community-based process. So that goes to that question again of, yes, communities can be actively involved. More broadly, the idea that the Australian community, per se, doesn't care. No, well, let's not forget that the single most successful referendum. We've had 44 referendums in Australia. Only 8 have been successful. The most successful referendum in Australian history in 1967, at a time when people like my father were being beaten up in jails, were being locked up, essentially for being black, almost 100% of the population voted yes at that time. And that was a community-driven political movement, a grassroots, grounds up, knock on the door political movement. People like Pastor Sir Doug Nicholls, who's a political giant amongst Aboriginal people, who went around knocking on doors and motivating people, getting people behind that cause. I think what happens politically is that we have become so polarised and so fractured, the very issues that I talked about, the hollowing out of democracy, the sense that many people have that democracy doesn't speak to me anymore, has seen people drift to the margins, this fracturing and polarisation of our politics. And so increasingly elections are fought on issues at the margins. How do we get, we know, go to an election, we know that 39% of people are going to vote Labor and 39 to 40% are going to vote Liberal, whatever, may switch around. That's basically locked in. So what about that other 20%? That's where elections are won. And that other 20% is growing. A third of people are now no longer interested in voting for either of the major parties. So groups like One Nation and others, small parties, but with outsized influence. And so what we see is a political discourse that appeals to those fringes, that seeks to garner that support while ignoring the great majority of Australians who may want a very different political outcome. So I wouldn't necessarily agree with the premise that people don't care or don't want the change. I don't think that's reflected in our political discourse, which is far more fractured and polarised and focused on this appeal to the margins where the votes are, to harvest those votes to get back into power. But I think broadly, as Australians, I've seen an enormous shift in my own lifetime. I'm born before 67. If you look at the arc of that change, 67, Mabo decision, where we are today, I've seen an enormous change. And I've seen enormous awareness growing amongst people. I don't think we should lose sight of that and be distracted by the politics of the age, which is more fractured and polarised. And there was one down here who's been waiting the whole time. It's hard. No one sees down the front.
Thank you, Stan.
No worries.
My name's Chantal. I'm a Barkindji woman. I guess my question for you is more...
Oh, that's near my people.
Yes, both
Yeah.
New South Wales.
Yeah,
mob.
I've got some Barkindji family, actually.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, Wilcannia.
We're mob then. That's
Yeah.
where my family's from.
True. You know Johnson's in Wilcannia?
Yes.
Yeah, my grandmother was... This is what we do.
This is how you connect.
My grandmother-
You know your mob when this done.
My grandmother's a Johnson.
Okay, my grandmother's Riley and
Oh.
Evanses and stuff.
Oh, okay.
And Edwards.
See?
So we'll talk
There you
after.
go.
I guess mine's more of an internal question, I guess. Being a fair-skinned Aboriginal woman, most of the time when I go to events, I have to
Prove and justify,
publicise my identity,
Yeah.
not just for myself, but for when I'm going as well. And I guess walking between two worlds, I'm actually finding it more challenging to walk in our world than I am non-Aboriginal world.
That's a great question.
And my question is like, I'm striving to be successful because I know that because I don't come from the right family, I don't come from the right skin colour, there's arguments about my tribal heritage and all those sort of complexities that you can't discuss with white people because Aboriginality in itself is a struggle that we're still trying to... my grandmother just passed and she was the gatekeeper that stopped me from going home, and it was actually my non-Indigenous father who protected me, but it was my Aboriginal family that was the one that was a danger to me.
Yeah.
But these are conversations you can't have outside of community, but then you start to challenge them in the community
Yeah.
and you get taxed. So I guess my question is I start to challenge my community on the idea of success as an Aboriginal
Yeah.
woman. I want to be financially successful
Yeah.
because... and I'm striving to become successful as an athlete because I seen the likes of Nova Paris,
Yeah.
Kathy Freeman. They're identifiably Aboriginal. How many identifiably famous Aboriginal people do we have that are fair-skinned?
Yeah. Well, I knew you were one of us as I saw you there. We know who we are, right?
Yes.
Yeah, we do. But this is, and this will have to be the last question because I do have a plane to catch and I'm on air again tonight. This is the madness of my life. But this is such a brilliant question. I'm so glad I got to you. Because I could tell while I was talking about some of those things, they were resonating with you. I could see that. This is, the idea of identity is caught up with the politics of our age. Part of the reason that we are seeing a polarisation and a fracturing of our political order is because people are privileging identity over citizenship. Rather than building civic bonds, which is much harder, we are retreating to our own corners, and that's dangerous. That is really dangerous. William Cooper, who you mentioned, Doug Nicholls, who I spoke about, the people who campaigned for 1967, the power of their struggle, Eddie Mabo, the power of that struggle was that it was building stronger foundations of our civic identity. What links us as Australians? Now, that doesn't mean that I'm Australian the same way that you're Australian or anyone else is Australian. We bring different things to this idea of what it is to be Australian. But they were about building solid platforms for that. I think that's what the Uluru Statement is about. I think that's what treaty is about. I think when you listen to people talk about these things, it is in terms of completing the idea of what it is to be an Australian. If we retreat into hardened identities, I know where that ends up. It ends up in conflict, and I've seen this all around the world. Look at the conflicts of our age. Sunni versus Shia, Israeli versus Palestinian. In Rwanda, the Rwandan genocide, Hutu versus Tutsi. North versus South Korea. What happened in Yugoslavia, in the Balkans? What happens in America, the American South versus the North? They're still fighting over the legacy of the Civil War. Identity, rooted in a sense of historical grievance, lies at the heart of all conflict in our world today. It is foundational. It is fundamental. The Indian philosopher and economist Amartya Sen calls these things solitarist identities. He says solitarist identities, identities that exclude, kill, they lead to violence. What he talks about is layered identity. I am a Wiradjuri Gamaroi person. I'm a journalist. I'm a husband. I'm a father. I lived outside of Australia for 18 years. You know, I speak a little bit of Chinese. You know, well, I lived there for 10 years. I can order food and get taxis and, you know. All of these things complete me. They're all a part of me. I don't privilege one part of myself over another, but in different contexts, different parts of me have greater importance. When I'm back home amongst my own family, my own people, of course, the society and the heritage and the culture and the history that I'm from is front and centre. But if I'm in New York or London or Paris, people may see me just as an Australian. And other aspects of my identity will come to the fore. When I'm at work, I'm a journalist, and there are aspects of an identity as a professional that will come to the fore. It doesn't mean that one cancels another out. It means that they round out the idea of you. They add layers to who you are. And I think this goes to your fundamental question, is that when you are an Aboriginal person and you don't conform to particular stereotypes, when you are not identifiably black, when you are successful so you're not disadvantaged, you know, when you don't meet those general preconceptions about what it is to be Aboriginal, the onus is on you somehow then to prove who you are. The Australian Law Reform Commission counts 64 different definitions of what it is to be Aboriginal over Australia's history. 64 different times we've had different labels applied to us. In the last census, I had to tick the box, as you were asked to tick as well, saying, are you Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander? It didn't ask whether I was Wiradjuri or Gamaroi. It didn't ask. No other Australian had to do that. We have to do that. And if I tick that box, how can that box contain all of the layers of my identity? And identity is not a foundation for justice. Identity is your personal choice. It's the many contradictions and distinctions in your own life. Ideas of justice need to be built on a neutrality and foundations of universal ideas of justice that all of us, irrespective of our particular ethnic backgrounds, can actually be a part of. But I know what you're saying is that the discussion within our communities is often more difficult than the discussion that I can have with all of you today. Because when you come from a people who have experienced the history that we've experienced, there is a wariness, there is a suspicion. People are suspicious of you if you're too successful. People wonder about you if you're too light-skinned. You know, oh, so you're only identifying as Aboriginal now, are you? Because that suits you now. You know, that is, in its own way, to go back to the very first question I got today, that's a colonised mind. Amongst our own people, those people that try to question your identity or your validity as an Aboriginal person are expressing the same view as the coloniser who told us that, you know, we were different, we were lesser because we were Aboriginal, because we were black. If we use that against each other, that is a colonised mind. You know, I watched the royal wedding last week with my wife, and it was a really interesting sort of moment, actually. Because I was sitting there, and there was me, my wife, who's non-Indigenous, her mother, whose long-time partner is a New Zealand Maori, her sister was out from Hawaii, who's married to a native Hawaiian, my son was there. So here we were, all mixed, all part of each other, family, watching Meghan Markle with a black mother and a white father marrying Prince Harry, and I thought, what is this notion and this power that we give to the idea of race? And all anyone could talk about was Meghan Markle being mixed race. Why is she seen as mixed race and no one else there? You know, DNA will tell you that we all share each other's DNA. We are all related to each other in various ways. There is no different species of human being. We are just humans, Homo sapiens. So when you deconstruct it and you tear all those things away, what are you left with? You're left with the idea of race as a social construct. And it's a social construct that has been used against people. It's been used to identify you as different and other. And on the basis of that identification, you will then be segregated or subjugated. It has been used to justify colonialism, invasion, Holocaust, genocide, all of the things that we've seen in our world on the basis of a fictitious, unscientific idea of race. So I think for our own people as well, if we don't stop using the discourse of race, if we don't start talking about universal ideas of justice, if we don't open up ideas of identity to involve and encapsulate all the layers of who we are, all the contradictions of who we are, that you can walk through the world as a Barkindji woman, you can also walk through the world as someone who has European heritage, you're a successful person, you're an athlete, all of those things are part of who you are. And if people try to limit us, if people try to put their own definitions of who you are on us, they are buying into that same defunct, unscientific, colonised concepts of race that are completely outdated and redundant. And I think that's where we need to be focusing on. So I'm glad you asked that question. It's a good question. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Stan.